In the grand halls of Kensington Palace, where centuries of royal tradition echo through marble corridors, a single moment of human vulnerability would shatter the carefully constructed facade of royal perfection. What started as a routine day for Royal Guard James Mitchell would become the defining moment of his 20-year career, when a desperate plea from Princess Charlotte would test everything he believed about duty, loyalty, and the price of silence. Behind the gilded gates and perfectly manicured gardens, a story was unfolding that the world would never see in the official royal photographs or carefully crafted press releases. It was a story of a young princess trapped by expectations, a dedicated guard wrestling with impossible choices, and the moment when two very different worlds collided in the most unexpected way. This is the true account of that day, when protocol meant nothing, when a child's cry for help would echo louder than any royal decree, and when a man trained to stand silent and still would find himself at the center of a storm that would change the British royal family forever. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine courtyards of Kensington Palace as James Mitchell adjusted his ceremonial uniform for what he thought would be another ordinary day. At 42 years old, James had served as a royal protection officer for nearly 2 decades, his weathered hands steady despite the weight of responsibility that came with protecting the most famous family in the world. His deep blue eyes, which had seen countless state functions and private moments, scanned the familiar surroundings with practiced vigilance. James had joined the Metropolitan Police straight out of university, driven by a sense of duty instilled by his father, a former military officer who had served in Northern Ireland. The path to royal protection had been long and demanding, requiring years of specialized training, psychological evaluations, and an unwavering commitment to discretion. He had witnessed births, deaths, scandals, and celebrations, all while maintaining the invisible barrier that separated his world from theirs. The morning briefing had been routine, with no special events scheduled for Princess Charlotte. At 8 years old, she was known among the staff as a spirited and intelligent child who possessed an unusual awareness of her surroundings for someone so young. Unlike her brothers, who seemed to accept their royal status with casual indifference, Charlotte often appeared to struggle with the weight of expectations placed upon her small shoulders. As James took his position outside the princess's private study room, he reflected on the subtle changes he had noticed in the young royal over the past few months. The bright, inquisitive child who once peppered her tutors with endless questions had become increasingly withdrawn. Her laughter, once a frequent sound echoing through the palace corridors, had become rare and forced. The palace staff, trained to observe without commenting, had all noticed the change, but such concerns were never discussed openly. The morning progressed with its usual rhythm of lessons, supervised breaks, and carefully orchestrated activities designed to balance education with the demands of royal protocol. James maintained his post with military precision, his presence both protective and unobtrusive. He had perfected the art of being simultaneously invisible and vigilant, a shadow that moved with purpose but never drew attention to itself. At precisely 11:15, as morning lessons concluded, James noticed Princess Charlotte lingering in her study while her tutor gathered materials for the next session. Through the partially open door, he could see her sitting at the antique writing desk, her small fingers tracing patterns on the leather-bound notebook before her. Her posture, unusually slumped for a child trained in royal deportment from birth, suggested a weariness that seemed far beyond her years. The tutor, Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, a stern woman in her 60s who had educated countless aristocratic children, paused at the doorway. She glanced at Charlotte with the professional concern of an experienced educator, but protocol dictated that personal observations about royal children remain private. After a moment's hesitation, she quietly closed the door and moved on to prepare for the next lesson, leaving Charlotte alone in the study. James remained at his post, following standard procedure, but something about the silence from within the room caused his protective instincts to heighten. In his years of service, he had learned to distinguish between normal quiet and the kind of silence that suggested distress. The absence of usual sounds, the rustling of papers, the scratching of pencil on paper, or the gentle movement that typically accompanied a child's presence, created an atmosphere of unease. The palace around them continued its daily operations with clockwork precision. Housekeeping staff moved through distant corridors with whispered efficiency. Gardeners tended to the grounds visible through tall windows, and the constant, barely audible hum of security communications provided a backdrop to the morning routine. Yet within this bubble of organized activity, James sensed something shifting, though he could not yet identify what had triggered his growing concern. As the minutes passed, James found himself torn between his duty to maintain his position and an increasing urge to check on the young princess. Royal protection officers were trained to balance proximity with privacy, to be present without being intrusive, and to respond to threats without creating unnecessary alarm. The challenge lay in distinguishing between normal childhood behavior and genuine cause for concern. The weight of his responsibility pressed down on James as he considered the complexity of his role. He was not just a bodyguard, but a silent witness to the most private moments of royal life. He had seen the family's joys and sorrows, their public triumphs and private struggles, all while maintaining the professional distance that his position required. The trust placed in him was absolute, and any breach of that trust could end not only his career, but potentially compromise the security of the entire royal family. Yet as he stood outside that study door, James could not shake the feeling that something significant was about to happen. His training had taught him to trust his instincts, to recognize the subtle signs that often preceded security concerns or personal crises. The morning light streaming through the palace windows seemed somehow different, charged with intention that made the familiar surroundings feel foreign and unpredictable. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor caused James to straighten imperceptibly, his professional demeanor automatically engaging as other staff members passed by. A young housemaid offered a brief, respectful nod, while one of the senior butlers moved past with the purposeful stride of someone managing multiple responsibilities. These brief interactions, conducted entirely through gesture and expression, represented the complex social hierarchy that governed palace life. As the corridor returned to relative quiet, James became aware of a sound from within the study that made his breath catch in his throat. It was barely audible, muffled by the heavy door and thick walls, but unmistakably the sound of someone crying. Not the dramatic tears of a child's tantrum or the brief upset that might follow a minor disappointment, but the kind of deep, quiet sobbing that spoke of genuine distress and carefully contained emotion. The sound continued for several minutes, during which James struggled with the competing demands of his training and his human instincts. Protocol dictated that he should not intrude on the private moments of royal family members unless specifically requested or unless he perceived a direct threat to their safety. Yet every fiber of his being, both as a protection officer and as a human being, urged him to respond to what was clearly a child in distress. The crying gradually subsided, replaced by an even more concerning silence. James strained to hear any indication of movement or activity from within the room, but the heavy door and walls designed for privacy made it impossible to discern what was happening. His training had prepared him for many scenarios, from terrorist threats to medical emergencies. But this situation fell into a gray area where professional protocol and human compassion seemed to conflict. As the clock on the corridor wall approached 11:30, James knew that the next tutor would arrive within minutes to begin the afternoon session. The schedule that governed Princess Charlotte's days was precise and inflexible, designed to maximize her education while accommodating the numerous royal commitments that would shape her future. Any disruption to this schedule would be noted and potentially investigated, adding another layer of complexity to James's dilemma. The approaching footsteps of Mrs. Catherine Wells, the afternoon music instructor, echoed down the corridor with their characteristic quick, light pace. A former concert pianist who had retired to teach the children of wealthy families, Mrs. Wells was known for her punctuality and her no-nonsense approach to musical education. Her arrival would normally signal Charlotte to prepare for her piano lesson. But James realized with growing concern that he had heard no movement from within the study for several minutes. Mrs. Wells paused as she reached James, her expression questioning as she noted his unusually tense posture. In the unspoken communication that governed palace interactions, she raised an eyebrow slightly, a gesture that asked whether everything was as it should be. James responded with an almost imperceptible shake of his head, a signal that caused the music teacher to pause in her approach to the door. The three of them, James outside the door, Mrs. Wells in the corridor, and Princess Charlotte somewhere within the silent study, existed in a moment of suspended tension that seemed to stretch far longer than the few seconds it actually encompassed. In that moment, the carefully orchestrated world of royal routine teetered on the edge of something unplanned and potentially significant, waiting for someone to make the first move that would determine what happened next. Mrs. Wells approached the study door with her usual confident stride, but paused when she noticed James's subtle gesture of caution. The music instructor had worked with the royal family for 3 years and had developed a keen sensitivity to the unspoken communications that govern palace life. She recognized the tension in James's posture and the concern in his eyes, even though his expression remained professionally neutral. With a gentle knock that echoed through the heavy wooden door, Mrs. Wells announced her arrival. "Your Royal Highness, it's time for your piano lesson." The response she expected, a cheerful acknowledgement or perhaps a request for a few more minutes, never came. Instead, the silence from within the room seemed to deepen, becoming almost tangible in its intensity. James and Mrs. Wells exchanged glances, both recognizing that something was significantly wrong. The music teacher knocked again, this time with more urgency. "Princess Charlotte, may I come in?" Again, no response came from beyond the door. Mrs. Wells placed her hand on the ornate door handle, but hesitated, knowing that entering a royal's private space without permission was a serious breach of protocol. It was then that they heard it, a voice so quiet and strained that it barely penetrated the thick door. "Help me," came the whispered plea, followed by words that made James's blood run cold. "Please, someone help me. I can't do this anymore." Without hesitation, James stepped forward and gently turned the door handle. Royal protocol, careers, and consequences became secondary concerns in the face of a child's desperate cry for help. As the door opened, both adults were confronted with a scene that would remain etched in their memories forever. Princess Charlotte sat on the floor beside her desk, her back against the wall, her knees drawn up to her chest. Her usually impeccable appearance was disheveled, her hair falling across her face, partially concealing eyes red from crying. In her small hands, she clutched a piece of paper so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. The sight of a normally composed and well-presented princess in such obvious distress shocked both adults into momentary silence. James immediately assessed the room for any signs of physical threat or injury, his training automatically engaging even as his heart went out to the distressed child. Finding no immediate danger, he slowly approached Charlotte, careful not to make any sudden movements that might startle her further. Mrs. Wells remained by the door, ready to call for additional help if needed, but understanding instinctively that this was a moment that required careful handling. "Your Royal Highness," James said softly, using the formal address even in this intimate moment of crisis. "What's wrong? How can we help you?" His voice, trained to remain calm under pressure, carried a warmth that transcended the usual formality of royal interactions. Charlotte looked up at him, and James was struck by the profound sadness in her young eyes. For a moment, she seemed unable to speak, as if the weight of whatever was troubling her had stolen her voice. Then, in a rush of words that tumbled over each other in their urgency, she began to speak. "I found something," she whispered, holding up the crumpled paper in her hands. "Something terrible, about my family, about things that happened before I was born. I wasn't supposed to see it, but I did, and now I can't stop thinking about it." Her voice broke as she continued. I don't know what to do with what I know. I can't tell Mama and Papa because it would hurt them, but I can't pretend I don't know either. James felt his heart sink as he realized the complexity of the situation unfolding before him. In his years of service, he had witnessed many family secrets and private moments, but he had never been directly confronted by a child struggling with knowledge that was clearly beyond her years to process. He glanced at Mrs. Wells, who had moved closer and now knelt beside Charlotte, her professional demeanor softened by genuine concern. What kind of thing did you find, sweetheart? Mrs. Wells asked gently, abandoning formal address in favor of the maternal comfort that the situation seemed to require. Her voice carried the warmth of someone who had spent years working with children and understood their emotional needs. Charlotte's grip on the paper tightened as she struggled to find words for what she had discovered. It's about my great-uncle, she said finally. About things he did during the war that nobody talks about. Bad things. Things that made people suffer. She looked up at James with eyes that seemed far too old for her 8-year-old face. The paper says he knew about places where people were being hurt, and he didn't stop it. Maybe he even helped. The weight of Charlotte's revelation settled over the room like a heavy blanket. James understood immediately the magnitude of what the young princess was grappling with. Royal families, like all families, carried secret from their past, but for royals, these secrets carried the additional burden of public scrutiny and historical legacy. For a child to stumble upon such information was devastating enough, but for that child to be a future member of the monarchy made the situation exponentially more complex. Where did you find this paper? James asked carefully, knowing that the source of the information would be crucial in determining how to proceed. He needed to understand whether Charlotte had discovered official documents, private correspondence, or perhaps something less reliable. Charlotte pointed toward her desk, where several history books lay open alongside her regular school materials. I was doing research for my history project about our family during World War II, she explained. Mrs. Hartwell gave me access to some of the family archives. Most of it was just boring letters and official documents, but then I found this. She held up the paper again. It was tucked inside one of the photo albums, like someone had hidden it there. James extended his hand slowly, asking without words if he could see the document. Charlotte hesitated for a moment, then carefully handed over the paper that had caused her such distress. As he unfolded it, James could see that it was indeed a historical document bearing official letterheads and stamps that suggested its authenticity. The content, while not explicitly incriminating, contained enough suggestive language and circumstantial evidence to plant serious doubts about certain royal family members' actions during the war. Mrs. Wells read over James's shoulder, her expression growing increasingly grave as she processed the implications of what Charlotte had discovered. The document detailed meetings between Charlotte's great-uncle and officials from various organizations, including some that history had later revealed to be connected to activities that would be considered war crimes by modern standards. How long have you known about this? James asked Charlotte, his voice gentle but concerned. 3 days, she replied, fresh tears beginning to form in her eyes. I haven't slept properly since I found it. Every time I look at the family portraits in the corridors, I think about what he might have done. Every time someone talks about royal duty and serving the people, I wonder if we're all just pretending to be good when maybe we're not. The profound nature of Charlotte's moral crisis became clear to both adults. This was not simply about discovering an unpleasant family secret, but about a young girl's entire worldview being challenged by information she was emotionally unprepared to process. The weight of royal identity, with all its associated expectations and responsibilities, had suddenly become entangled with questions about guilt, complicity, and moral responsibility that would challenge even mature adults. James realized that they were dealing with a crisis that went far beyond his training as a protection officer. This was a child experiencing a profound existential crisis, questioning not just her family's past, but her own identity and future role. The carefully constructed narrative of royal benevolence and public service that had shaped Charlotte's understanding of herself and her destiny had been shattered by a single document. "I don't know who I can trust," Charlotte continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "If this is true, then everything I've been taught about my family, about my future role, might be built on lies. How can I become queen someday if I'm part of a family that did terrible things? How can I serve people when I carry this secret?" Mrs. Wells reached out and gently took Charlotte's hand. "You are not responsible for things that happened before you were born," she said firmly but kindly. "Whatever your great-uncle may or may not have done, it doesn't define who you are or who you can become." But Charlotte shook her head, showing a maturity and understanding of royal responsibility that was both impressive and heartbreaking. "But it does," she insisted. "Everything our family has ever done becomes part of who I am. That's what being royal means. I carry the history, the good and the bad. And if I know about something terrible and I don't do anything about it, doesn't that make me part of the problem?" James found himself in completely uncharted territory. His training had prepared him for physical threats, security breaches, and protocol violations, but nothing had prepared him for this moment of moral crisis from a child who possessed both the innocence of youth and the burden of future royal responsibility. He realized that his response in the next few minutes could have profound implications not just for Charlotte's immediate emotional state, but for her entire future relationship with her royal identity. The sound of footsteps in the corridor reminded all three of them that the palace continued to function around their private crisis. Other staff members were going about their duties, schedules were being maintained, and the carefully orchestrated world of royal routine continued its relentless pace. Yet within this small study, time seemed suspended as they grappled with questions that had no easy answers. Charlotte looked up at James with desperate hope in her eyes. "You've been around our family for so long," she said. "You must know things. You must understand how complicated everything is. What am I supposed to do with this knowledge? How do I live with knowing something terrible about my own family while still preparing to represent that family to the world?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that extended far beyond the immediate moment. James realized that his response would not only affect Charlotte's immediate crisis, but could influence her entire future relationship with her royal role and responsibilities. James found himself standing at the crossroads of his career, his principles, and his humanity. The weight of Charlotte's questions seemed to press down on him like a physical force, making him acutely aware of every breath, every heartbeat, every second that passed in the silence that followed her desperate plea for guidance. His hands, steady through countless security operations and royal functions, trembled almost imperceptibly as he considered the magnitude of the moment. Looking down at the document in his hands, James recognized the careful language of diplomatic correspondence, the coded phrases, and oblique references that characterized official communications from that era. While not explicitly incriminating, the content was sufficient to raise serious questions about moral compromises that may have been made during wartime. More importantly, he understood that for an 8-year-old girl, the document represented a shattering of innocence and a premature confrontation with the complex moral ambiguities that adults spend lifetimes learning to navigate. "Your Royal Highness," James began carefully, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his mind. "What you've discovered is indeed serious, and your response shows the depth of your character and moral awareness. But before we decide what to do next, I think we need to talk about what this document actually means and what it doesn't mean." Charlotte wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, looking up at him with desperate attention. Mrs. Wells remained close beside her, providing silent support while recognizing that this conversation required James's unique perspective as someone who had observed royal family dynamics for decades. During the Second World War, James continued, settling himself on the floor beside Charlotte so that they were at eye level. The world was a very different place. People faced impossible choices, situations where there were no clearly right answers, only different degrees of wrong. Your great-uncle lived through times when survival itself was uncertain, when the very existence of your family and this country was threatened. He paused, choosing his words with extreme care, knowing that what he said next could shape Charlotte's understanding of morality, responsibility, and the complexities of leadership for the rest of her life. That doesn't excuse any wrongdoing if wrongdoing occurred, but it helps us understand the context in which decisions were made. Sometimes good people make bad choices when they're faced with impossible situations. Charlotte absorbed this information with the intense concentration of a child, trying to make sense of an adult world that seemed suddenly incomprehensible. But if he did bad things, shouldn't someone say so? Shouldn't people know the truth? She asked, her voice small but determined. Mrs. Wells leaned forward slightly. Truth is important, sweetheart, but so is understanding all the facts before making judgments. This one document, while significant, might not tell the whole story. There might be other documents, other evidence, other explanations that would change how we understand what happened. James nodded, grateful for Mrs. Wells's support in navigating this delicate conversation. Mrs. Wells is absolutely right. One of the most important things I've learned in my years of service is that situations are almost always more complicated than they first appear. Before anyone could make decisions about this information, it would need to be thoroughly investigated by historians and experts who understand that time period. Charlotte considered this for a moment, then asked the question that James had been dreading. But what do I do right now? Today? Tomorrow? How do I look at the family portraits and sit through lessons about royal duty when I have this knowledge in my head? The question struck at the heart of the crisis, moving beyond the historical implications to address Charlotte's immediate emotional and psychological needs. James realized that his role had shifted from protector of physical safety to guardian of a young girl's moral development and psychological well-being. I think, James said slowly, the first thing you need to understand is that you are not carrying this burden alone anymore. Mrs. Wells and I are here with you now, and we're going to help you figure out the right way to handle this situation. You don't have to make these difficult decisions by yourself. The relief that washed over Charlotte's face was immediately apparent. The isolation and fear that had been consuming her for 3 days began to give way to something resembling hope. For the first time since discovering the document, she was no longer alone with her terrible knowledge. But we also need to be very careful about how we proceed. James continued, his protection officer instincts asserting themselves. This kind of information, whether it's ultimately proven true or false, could be very damaging if it became public before being properly investigated and understood. There are people who would use something like this to hurt your family, regardless of whether the accusations are fair or accurate. Mrs. Wells added gently, which means we need to think carefully about who we share this with. And when your parents, your grandmother, they all have experience dealing with complex family history and public scrutiny. But they also need to be approached in the right way, at the right time, with the right support. Charlotte nodded slowly, beginning to understand that the situation required not just moral clarity, but strategic thinking. So, what happens next? Do we tell Mama and Papa? Do we give this to someone who can investigate it properly? Do we try to find more information first? James felt the weight of responsibility settle even more heavily on his shoulders. The questions Charlotte was asking were the same ones he had been grappling with since the moment she handed him the document. Each possible course of action carried significant risks and consequences, not just for Charlotte, but for the entire royal family. I think, he said finally, we need to approach this step by step. First, we need to make sure you're emotionally ready to deal with whatever comes next. This has been traumatic for you, and your well-being has to be our primary concern. Mrs. Wells reached into her bag and pulled out a bottle of water, offering it to Charlotte. When did you last eat something? She asked with the practical concern of someone accustomed to caring for children. I don't remember, Charlotte admitted. I haven't been hungry. Every time I think about eating, I just think about the document, and I feel sick. James exchanged a concerned look with Mrs. Wells. The physical symptoms Charlotte was describing suggested that the stress of her discovery was affecting her more severely than they had initially realized. The combination of sleep deprivation, loss of appetite, and emotional distress could have serious consequences for a child's health and development. "We're going to take care of you," James assured her. "But part of taking care of you means making sure you eat properly and get enough sleep. We can't make good decisions when our bodies aren't functioning properly." Charlotte managed a weak smile, the first expression of anything approaching happiness that she had shown since they entered the room. "You sound like Mama when she's worried about me," she said, and then her expression grew troubled again. "What will she think when she finds out what I know? Will she be angry that I was looking through family documents? Will she be hurt that I found something terrible about our family?" The questions revealed another layer of Charlotte's distress. Beyond the moral implications of what she had discovered, she was also dealing with guilt about having accessed the information in the first place, and fear about how her parents would react to her discovery. "Your mother loves you," Mrs. Wells said firmly. "Whatever else happens, whatever decisions need to be made, that will never change. Parents sometimes make mistakes, families sometimes have difficult histories, but that doesn't change the love between family members." James found himself thinking about his own relationship with his parents, about the moments when he had discovered that adults he trusted had made decisions he didn't understand or approve of. "When I was about your age," he said, surprising himself by sharing something personal, "I found out that my father had done something during his military service that I thought was wrong. I was angry and confused, and I didn't know how to reconcile the father I loved with the soldier who had made a decision I couldn't understand." Charlotte looked at him with intense interest, grateful for any perspective that might help her make sense of her own situation. "What did you do?" she asked. "I talked to him about it," James replied. "It was one of the hardest conversations I've ever had, but it helped me understand that good people sometimes make choices that seem wrong from the outside, especially when they're operating under pressure and with incomplete information. It didn't make his decision right, but it helped me understand that people are more complicated than the single worst thing they might have done." The wisdom of this observation seemed to resonate with Charlotte, who nodded thoughtfully. "So you think I should talk to Mama and Pop about this?" "I think," James said carefully, "that eventually, yes, you should talk to your parents. But I also think we need to prepare for that conversation carefully. We need to think about how to present the information in a way that's constructive rather than just upsetting. And we need to make sure you have the support you need to deal with their reaction, whatever that might be." Mrs. Wells checked her watch and realized that they had been in the study for nearly an hour. Other people would be wondering where Charlotte was, why her schedule had been disrupted. The carefully maintained routine of royal life would not wait indefinitely for personal crises to resolve themselves. "We're going to need to make some immediate decisions," she said quietly to James. "People will be looking for Charlotte soon, and we need to decide how much to explain about what's happened here." James nodded, recognizing that they had moved from the realm of emotional support into practical crisis management. Decisions made in the next few hours could have far-reaching consequences for Charlotte, for her family, and potentially for the monarchy itself. The weight of that responsibility was almost overwhelming, but he knew that retreat was no longer an option. "Charlotte," he said, turning back to the young princess, "we need your help in deciding how to move forward. You're the one who found this information. You're the one who will have to live with the consequences of whatever decisions we make. What do you think should happen next?" Charlotte sat in contemplative silence for several long moments, the weight of James's question settling over her like a mantle of responsibility far beyond her years. In those moments, the three adults could almost see her processing not just the immediate decision before them, but the larger implications of what it meant to be royal, to carry secrets, and to navigate the complex relationship between personal truth and public responsibility. "I think," she said finally, her voice stronger than it had been all morning, "that I need to tell Mama first. Not Papa, not Grandmama, but Mama. She always knows what to do when things are complicated." Charlotte paused, then added with surprising wisdom, "And I think she needs to know that I found this by accident, not because I was trying to find secrets about our family." James felt a surge of admiration for Charlotte's maturity and emotional intelligence. Even in crisis, she was thinking strategically about how to present information in a way that would be least harmful to family relationships. It was a skill that many adults struggled with, yet she seemed to possess it intuitively. "That sounds like a wise plan," Mrs. Wells agreed. "Your mother has experience dealing with difficult family history and public scrutiny. She'll know how to help you process this information and decide what to do next." James found himself facing perhaps the most important decision of his career. Protocol dictated that any significant incident involving a royal family member should be reported immediately to his superiors. Yet he also recognized that this was not a typical security situation, but rather a deeply personal family matter that required careful handling. The wrong approach could not only damage Charlotte's relationship with her family, but could also potentially expose sensitive historical information before it could be properly evaluated and contextualized. "If we're going to talk to your mother," he said slowly, "we need to think about when and how to have that conversation. This isn't the kind of thing that can be rushed or handled casually." Charlotte nodded, understanding instinctively that the conversation she was proposing would require careful preparation and the right circumstances. "Could we ask her to come here?" she suggested. "To my study? That way we could show her the document and explain how I found it without other people around." The suggestion revealed Charlotte's growing understanding of the delicate nature of the situation. By requesting privacy for the conversation, she was demonstrating an awareness that this information could have implications beyond the immediate family. Mrs. Wells smiled slightly, impressed by the young girl's emotional maturity under such difficult circumstances. "I think that's an excellent idea," James said. "But before we contact your mother, I think we should take a few minutes to think about how to explain what happened. We want to make sure we present the information clearly and calmly, without causing unnecessary alarm." As they began to discuss how to approach Charlotte's mother, the sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor reminded them that the outside world continued to function normally. James recognized the distinctive pace of Charlotte's personal secretary, Miss Sarah Pemberton, who would be arriving to coordinate the afternoon's activities. "Your Royal Highness," came Miss Pemberton's voice through the door, accompanied by a gentle knock. "I hope your music lesson is going well. I wanted to remind you that you have a call scheduled with your grandmother at 2 o'clock. Charlotte looked at James and Mrs. Wells with panic in her eyes, suddenly overwhelmed by the prospect of resuming normal activities while carrying the weight of her recent discovery. The thought of speaking with her grandmother, maintaining the usual pleasantries, and discussing routine matters seemed impossible when her mind was consumed with questions about family history and moral responsibility. "Can you manage that call?" James asked quietly. "Or should we ask your mother to speak with your grandmother and perhaps postpone it?" Charlotte considered the question seriously, weighing her emotional state against her royal obligations. "I think I can do it," she said finally. "Grandmama always asks about my studies, and I can tell her about my history project without mentioning what I found. It might actually be good practice for learning how to carry difficult knowledge without letting it show." The sophisticated understanding implicit in Charlotte's response struck both adults forcefully. She was already beginning to grasp one of the fundamental challenges of royal life, the necessity of maintaining public composure and fulfilling obligations regardless of personal circumstances. It was a lesson that many royals took years to learn, yet Charlotte seemed to be developing this understanding organically in response to her current crisis. Mrs. Wells stepped forward and opened the door to address Miss Pemberton. "The princess will be ready for her afternoon schedule shortly," she said with the professional courtesy that characterized all palace interactions. "We're just finishing up a discussion about her history project, which has raised some interesting questions about family archives." Miss Pemberton nodded politely, accustomed to the minor schedule adjustments that were common in royal households. "Of course. Shall I inform Her Royal Highness the Princess of Wales that her daughter would like to meet with her this afternoon? I believe she has some time available around 4 o'clock." James and Charlotte exchanged glances, both recognizing that the moment of decision had arrived more quickly than they had anticipated. Yes, please, Charlotte said, her voice steady despite the nervous energy that James could see in her posture. Could you ask if she could come to my study? I have some materials here that I'd like to show her. After Ms. Pemberton departed to arrange the meeting, the three of them found themselves alone again, with several hours to prepare for what would undoubtedly be a difficult conversation. James realized that his role was evolving from protection officer to counselor, helping Charlotte prepare emotionally and practically for a discussion that could have far-reaching consequences. How are you feeling about talking to your mother? Mrs. Wells asked gently, settling back in her chair beside Charlotte. Nervous, Charlotte admitted, but also a little bit relieved. I've been carrying this secret for 3 days, and it's been getting harder and harder to act normal around everyone. Maybe once Mama knows, we can figure out what to do together. James found himself thinking about the broader implications of Charlotte's situation beyond the immediate family dynamics. If the document she had discovered contained genuine historical significance, it would eventually need to be evaluated by historians and archivists. If it revealed previously unknown information about royal family members' wartime activities, it could have implications for public understanding of that historical period. Yet all of these considerations had to be balanced against the immediate need to support an 8-year-old girl who was struggling with information far beyond her emotional capacity to process alone. While we're waiting for your mother, he suggested, would it be helpful to talk through some of the questions she might ask? We could practice how to explain what happened and how you're feeling about it. Charlotte nodded eagerly, grateful for any preparation that might make the upcoming conversation easier. I think she'll want to know exactly how I found the document and whether I was supposed to have access to those archives. Those are good questions to prepare for, Mrs. Wells agreed. She'll also probably want to understand how this discovery has been affecting you emotionally. She'll be concerned about your well-being first and foremost. As they spent the next hour discussing how to approach the conversation with Charlotte's mother, James found himself repeatedly impressed by the young girl's thoughtfulness and maturity. Despite the trauma of her discovery and the uncertainty about what would happen next, she consistently demonstrated concern for others' feelings and an understanding of the complex responsibilities that came with her royal status. The afternoon sunlight, streaming through the study windows, gradually shifted as the time for Charlotte's meeting with her mother approached. James realized that once that conversation took place, there would be no returning to the relative simplicity of the morning, when only 3 people knew about Charlotte's discovery. Soon, the circle of knowledge would expand, and with it, the complexity of managing both the information itself and its potential consequences. At precisely 4 o'clock, they heard the familiar sound of Charlotte's mother's footsteps in the corridor. James straightened instinctively, his professional demeanor reasserting itself even as he remained acutely aware of the personal nature of the situation they were about to navigate. "Are you ready?" he asked Charlotte softly. Charlotte took a deep breath, looked at the document that had caused so much turmoil, and then back at James and Mrs. Wells. "I think so," she said, then added with a small smile, "Thank you for helping me. I don't know what I would have done if I had to handle this alone." As Charlotte's mother approached the study door, James realized that the next hour would not only determine how the royal family dealt with a potentially significant historical discovery, but would also shape Charlotte's understanding of truth, responsibility, and the complex moral landscape that she would navigate for the rest of her life. The young girl's desperate plea for help had set in motion a series of events that would test not only family relationships, but also the very foundations of how the royal family understood and presented their own history. The gentle knock on the door announced the arrival of the moment that would change everything for Charlotte, her family, and potentially for the monarchy itself. As James prepared to step back into his professional role, while remaining available to support Charlotte through whatever came next, he reflected on how a single morning had transformed his understanding of his own responsibilities and the complex human dynamics that existed behind the carefully maintained facade of royal life. The door opened, and Charlotte's mother entered the study with the warm smile she always wore when visiting her daughter, completely unaware that she was about to be confronted with information that would challenge everything she thought she knew about her family's history and her daughter's emotional state. In that moment, as the three of them prepared to share Charlotte's burden with someone who had the authority and experience to help determine what should happen next, James understood that they had reached the point of no return, where secrets would become shared knowledge, and where the consequences of truth would finally begin to unfold.